Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusallihu ala rasulih al-kareem. Amma ba'd. A struggle for our humanity. Black history in the light of Islam. It is a struggle for our humanity because the institution of slavery orchestrated and practiced by Western Europeans and the new American colonialists was a system intended to dehumanize a people, strip them of their heritage, and assimilate them into the Greco-Roman Christian dogma. The African slaves and others resisted this slavery because it was inhumane. Yet the impact of this system is far-reaching and generational. That story is black history. What is the origin of black history in this country? What roles do the black African American and American Muslims play in that history? Furthermore, what does Islam say about slavery? What does it say about the treatment of slaves? Did the African Muslim slaves suffer the same treatment under the chattel system of slavery? Was there a difference? How should Muslims think about black history in Islam? Is black history in America intricately linked to the story of Islam in the world? These are questions we need to answer. We will try to answer these questions, certainly not in detail, but with key concepts that may open the conversation and continue it for more thorough answers to this query. The struggle for humanity is connected to black history since the history of the African slave trade is one people's effort to dehumanize another for the sake of profit. What is slavery? Slavery was a solution and an institution, a business and an injustice. The institution was a remedy to deal with the masses of human beings that were left homeless, without property, and without government after war. Prisoners of war, orphans, widows, women, and debtors. Inherently, slavery was and is an economic system of exchange and trade. However, the degree to which countries used and use slavery to upend their economic solvency is when greed, injustice, and oppression become normalized into slavery. Slavery was practiced throughout the known world and it exists today. As we follow the timeline, we notice parallel realities. When slavery legitimizes injustice, oppression, or human abuse, resistance, rebellion, and abolition follow. This is natural to the inclinations of human beings against oppression. In societies, these circumstances create the conditions of unrest and war, or it may lead to a more intense enslavement practices or a more insidious oppression. We'll also use the timeline to follow Africans and African Muslims' history in slavery, colonialist imperialism, and American slavery. Slavery reveals human character. If you are free and you take a slave, how you treat the slave is directly related to who you are. How the slave treats you is directly related to who the slave is. Each station reveals the good or evil of human behavior. Slavery can be a curse or it can be a blessing. So we have the causes of slavery. Those are some are agreed upon, others may not be agreed upon. Then we have the effect of slavery, which in essence is black history. The effect of slavery is in essence black history in this country and around the world, so to speak, because there was not one nation that did not participate in slavery in some form, and certainly there was not one nation except for the smaller nations that were not considered quote unquote civilized nations, but of the quote unquote empires that existed at the time of the transatlantic slave trade, all of them participated and gained wealth from that system. And in his input subsequently input a system of management that persists today. So African American Muslims are important in that in-between stage when how did, inshallah, the caliber or the measure of treatment of dehumanization that went on might have been allayed or might have been not as bad as we want to say that because of the presence of Muslims in that slave system. And that we're talking about a spiritual reality as well. So we're going to, so what is slavery? We have two definitions here from slavery. One is the definition from the United Nations. The initial definition was from the League of Nations, which was the prior name of United Nations. So we look at the two definitions. Let me read them for you. The status or condition of a person over whom any or all the powers attaching to the right ownership are exercised and included all acts involved in the capture, acquisition, or disposal of a person with intent to reduce him to slavery. Acts involved in the acquisition of a slave with a view to selling or exchanging him. All acts of disposal by sale or exchange of a slave acquired with a view to being sold or exchanged, and in general, every act of trade or transport in slaves. So we can see, look at that definition. There's a stark contrast. We look at the second definition, which is the Islamic view, and you're going to see the contrast. And I want you to, in your mind, think about what is the difference between these two definitions in terms of the treatment of or the institution of slavery.
and the treatment of slaves. Because remember that slavery is all about the treatment of human beings. It's all about that. It's probably the only institution, except for family, it's the only institution that we can actually think of where you can actually get a viewpoint of human behavior, a clear viewpoint of human behavior. And it is unique in the sense that when a person takes a slave, they're usually not family members. So what's required from the family members that take a slave is that you give up, and this is in the Islamic view, we're gonna look at this, that you give up yourself to someone else who's not from your blood. That's a hard one to attach to for humanity. So the mainstream view, that's the consensus here, the Quran recognizes the basic inequality between master and slave. This is very important. And the rights of the former slave, of the former over the other. In other words, Islam recognizes the institution of slavery, that it is a pre-existing institution. Remember that the Prophet ﷺ did not come to change necessarily things. He came to improve, to enhance, to keep what was good and to enhance what was good, enhance that, and to remove what was not good for human behavior, for human beings. So we have the institution of slavery that was pre-existing. It's like the female, I compare it to the female circumcision that was practiced quite a bit before the Prophet ﷺ. When he did not tell the people, just don't do it. He didn't say it was haram. He said, just minimize how much you do it. Because he knew that there's, like in the same scenario with the drinking of wine, alcohol, and what time waited, he did not order that the Sahaba stop drinking alcohol immediately. And we have the Quran where it says this: if you had been harsh to him, then they surely would have left you. So gradually, a process of time, things that are not good for humanity, things that become abused by other human beings, gradually over time in Islam, you can see how they gradually step back, and eventually those things were minimized. So this is the impetus of slavery here, where the definition is taken from this historian called Brunsvig. He states that from a spiritual perspective, the slave has the same value as the free man, and the same eternity as is in store for his soul. In this earthly life, failing emancipation, there remains the fact of his inferior status to which he must piously resign himself. So we talked about earlier how the slave owner treats the slave and how the slave himself deals with the owner. So those two relationships are stated in this particular definition. So we talked about slavery as a institution and as a remedy and as a business and as an injustice. So these definitions, we can see the difference is the first definition is positing the slave as an economic property. We're going to use the term person-commodification later on, inshallah. We can see about what that looks like. As different from the Islamic definition. I want to just look at these maps real quick. We're talking about the world before the African transatlantic slave trade. Why is this important? Because the first civilization was not the European civilization, and the first activity was not this oppression of African slaves. This was not the first. There was an existing reality way before the European came on the set. Well, the European, we're talking about Rome, was an early empire, and when Rome fell, when Rome was defeated, then the European empire went into dark ages. And then that dark ages, during that dark ages, Islam was rising. All right, Islam was rising. So we're talking about 500 to 1,000 Europeans were in dark ages. They were not producing anything. They had no leadership. They were not progressing in any form. They had barbarians, or they had other tribes moving into the Western European area, because it was literally lights out on Europe for that period of time, 500 to 1,000. But in the meantime, Islam was moving across the continents from 622 to 750 initially, because 750 was the period of time when Andalusia fell. But we had the Ottoman Empire over there on the eastern side of Sham that's continuing to grow and continue to move forward and continue to regulate Islam in the world from 750 on to 1918, when the last Caliphate was deposed. But also you have the African, and we're going to be looking at that map in just a second, we have the African empires that also are umbrellaed by this Andalusia and umbrellaed by the Ottoman Empire. We also have travel happening from West Africa and from Spain and from even South Africa coming into the quote unquote new world. We also have migration from over the Bering Strait and up underneath South America, from West Africa, from the Africans and from the Muslims coming into, Muslims literally coming into this quote unquote what they call the new world, what we want to call the Americas, having a relationship with the First Nations. That's very important to remember, that all of this was going on while the Western Europeans we're talking about are in this quote unquote dark ages. However, with the fall of Andalusia, now we have a door open. It's like the Muslims allowed a door to be flung open into Africa. And we have this great exploration into Africa, and we have this European Renaissance going on from 1300 to 1600. And then now, and it has not been stated, it's been talked about, it's controversial. Now we talk about the Islamic Dark Ages. From 750, even though we had the Ottoman Empire going on, the situation with Muslims and the Islamic states was tenuous at best. So we have, this is Islamic Dark Ages, we'll say from c. 1900 all the way to the present. We are not, Islam is not actively serving its purpose, that is to free the oppressed and assist the needy. So this is the map. On one map, you see this was Turtle Island, which is the European immigrants. But all of these lines that you see on that map are First Nations, the Iroquois, the Ojibwe, the Navajo, the Sioux. These are all nations. There was many as 775 million people in this continent when quote unquote Columbus so-called discovery, which is a fallacy. And also over here in Africa, we can see over here the Islamic empires happening here. Also in Africa, West Africa, major empires in West Africa, Mali, Songhai, we have the Ashanti, the Benin, and also down here in the central areas, we also have kingdoms here, Aksum over here with Ethiopia over here on the east. This is what was going on before the European up here began exploring Africa. So that's important, that it was full. You know, the continents were full of human beings. Advanced human beings. Yes, you had other quote unquote pagan tribes. You had other type forms of religion, etc. But Islam was pronounced as in terms of major, and Christianity was not. But Islam was pronounced. There were Christians in Africa, very small bands of Christians in Africa, even before the European explored. But major religion at this time, when the Europeans came and began to explore Africa, was Islam, and that's important to remember. The fall of Andalusia and European explorations. This is a very interesting quote here. This Kamal Hassan says, how they succumbed to the same diseases which brought down the mighty Roman Empire. They wrote all over Andalusia, La Ghaliba illa illallah. There's no vanquisher except Allah Ta'ala. But they worshiped the Mata Dunya, pleasure of the world, and traded their souls for gold, glory, women, and wine, only to end like stray donkeys kicked around by the boots of Ferdinand and Isabella. So we want to believe, and I am conjecturing here for the purpose of my talk, I'm conjecturing here that with the fall of Andalusia, which was the umbrella to Africa, the umbrella of protection for Africa, because even when it was falling, there was a war that was fought, and I'm going to switch to that page, even when it was in its decline, when the Christians were taking control, recapturing, as they say, with reconquistadors, the recapturing of Spain, even in that period, you have Yusuf bin Tashfin, who defeated the Christians, came up from Africa to assist the Muslims to get that state back because they had gone into a disunity, a disarray, because of their haggling over power. So they forgot the mission of Allah Ta'ala in this particular case. And by 1502, the Christian rulers issued an order requiring all Muslims to convert to Christianity. And when they didn't, they imposed brutal restrictions on the remaining Spanish Muslims. So they wanted to subjugate the Muslims over a period of time. So between 1144 and 1492, the Muslims were declining in power in Spain. And Spain's a small state, Portugal's a small state, and they had no outlet to the northwest. In the period of 1492, it was even worse because the river that services trade for Spain was silted. It was blocked. They couldn't get out. So they were looking for ways to grow their economy, ways to grow their state and become solvent again, recapture, and essentially get to the Renaissance and Reformation where this happens. But this happens, we have a period of 1400, the 15th century to the 17th century, actually to the 19th century. You have a period where the movement of the European into the African continent and into the quote unquote new world is happening. Let's look at that on the timeline really quickly. So we have in 1441, Portugal is the first nation, the first empire, quote unquote, to enter into Africa. They entered around, if you look at I'm gonna go to the next page, but let's go through this quickly. They start the first European slave trade, Portugal does, that's Henry the Navigator. Remember these names are gonna be coming up again, keep these names in mind. 235 Africans from the west coast. My daughter asked me, we're gonna hear from today, she asked me, she said, how did they get them? How did they get these Africans off the coast? How did they get them? Because they did not penetrate Africa. And Africa, inshallah, is a cliff. You know, if you go along West Africa, you're going to see a cliff situation. You're going to see it abuts the ocean. Cliffs abut the ocean, so you have to have some type of access into the interior of Africa, into the continent itself, from other places. Or if you're going to go in and it's going to take you a little walk into those countries before you can actually go in. Then you have to exercise that kidnapping. You have to abduct them in some form or another. So how did they get them? 235 African slaves, and that initiated the trade of human trade with Africa and Europe. So slave raids, and these are the ways that they were acquired: kidnapping, slave raids, wars, and literal slave markets that already existed in Africa. Slave markets already existed in Africa. There's different ways that people dealt with them. Muslims dealt with them with saying that we don't trade our brothers and sisters. We don't trade Muslims. Only non-Muslims can be traded. A lot of different discussions about how Africans were involved in the trade, especially Muslims were involved in the trade, but they were involved in the trade. So everybody was involved in the trade in some form or another. 1444, 1445, Nicholas, this is important here. And we're looking at that cause and effect and what happens in between. Pope Nicholas the Fifth issues a dictum, all right? This is Rome is rising, issues a dictum, and it says that Portugal has the right to continue the slave trade in West Africa. It gives them the right. And we call this, there was a line of demarcation that was established giving the European powers a certain right to continue doing what they were doing. There was no agreement on this from the Africans. This is just something that was done in Rome. So now, after 1460, this is after Prince Henry the Navigator died, any ship sailing for Africa required authorization from the crown. So that means it was legitimatized by the European nation, by Rome. It was legitimatized by Portuguese, the Spanish, and eventually England, France, Germany, etc. It was legitimatized. This slave system, this slave trade that was being carried on. But before the slaves were shipped, they had to be baptized before shipping. Remember that at the fall of Andalusia, in 1500, the Muslims, 1502, I think it was, the Muslims had lost their control and they were required to accept Christianity or suffer the consequences. We have the same thing going on with the slave trade. They have to be baptized before they're shipped, and their process of enslavement, which was viewed by critics as cruel, was justified by the conversion of the enslaved to Christianity. Now, how do they process that? I do not know that the conversion to Christianity, inshallah, but they're still going to be taken as slaves. So they have to be, the whole effort here, we're going to look at when we talk about the Spanish and the French coming in, but look at the map here. You'll see this is Portugal and its entrance into Africa, all along the coast, all the way up underneath South Africa and into the East African region, where they made agreements with the folk to trade slaves. So this is what it looks like. And then later on with the triangular trade, we have them over here in the quote unquote New World. This is the Portuguese Empire, the first to enter the transatlantic slave trade. Then we have Spain, the African slave trade. 1462, slave traders begin to operate in Seville, Spain. And if anybody's been to Spain, you know what I'm talking about. 1470s, merchants begin to trade large numbers of slaves. As a matter of fact, in 1500s, they said that 7.4% of the population in Seville, Spain, were slaves. And some historians conjecture that Spain was competing with England in terms of having the most amount of slaves, the highest amount of slaves in the Renaissance, during the Renaissance period. Now, this is the empires, and this is what it looked like early on prior to the actual triangular trade. These were the players, all right? Even over here in Russia, all right? We have England and all of these. And if you look at the rest of the world, we look at the maps previously, you look at the rest of the world, these are Western European, this is all that they were. This is literally all that they were up here in this very small block of land. All of this belonged to Islam. All of this. And yet Muslims were subjugated. And this was the effect of that subjugation was the African slave trade. We want to say, let's call the Africans black gold for the Europeans. They were considered black gold. Now we get into meat of it, the economics of transatlantic slavery. So now we have this sugar, we have this cotton, we have this tobacco, right? That is wanted, that is desired by these continents, by these empires. And so they have to be produced, and they don't have the manpower, they don't have the outlets, they don't have the ways and means to manage that within their own turf. So they've already gone out and captured slaves, and the slaves are used just for that, as cheap labor. We see that same system going on with the Mexicans coming into the country, being used as cheap labor because the society doesn't have enough. It's stratified to such a degree, the hierarchy doesn't have enough to provide for the labor that's needed at the bottom level, quote unquote, to actually farm the crops and harvest the crops and things that are required for these goods to be brought to market. So this system of getting laborers and the laborers farming the products and the products that are produced being taken back to Europe, produced and servicing the country itself, but taking back to Europe. This is the triangle trade. We'll talk about that. Two terms we'll look at. We'll look at person-commodification. Very interesting term here I found while I was doing my research. And a systematic process of exchange. All right. The real aim of colonialism was to control the people's wealth, what they produced, how they produced it. Njui wa Thiongo sees the way that control was introduced and managed was to deconstruct the people's sense of self and replace it with that of the colonizer. This would occur when a people's perception of themselves and their world was overthrown. We're going back to that theme of slavery, the theme of slavery and the intent of the slave owner in this case. And we're seeing through the mirror of Islam, the mirror of Islam, in terms of character development. We're able to see the characters, the players of this slavery, of this particular slave, this unique slave, chattel slave system of the transatlantic. There were other chattel slave systems. Rome initiated chattel slavery. Britain had chattel slavery amongst the Irish. Initially, the empires enslaved one another. This was not something that was a black and white thing. It wasn't even an imperialist thing. It was people thought that they were better than other people. Therefore, those people, and they also had products that needed to be produced, needed to be farmed. And they had to provide labor for that, cheap labor, so we can get our costs low, we can lower our costs for the labor. We're not going to, regular workers are not going to work for you like that. They have criteria. So therefore we have to find workers who are going to work for little or nothing in order to produce our economics. And this is what we're looking at here. So we have the words colonization. What is that? What is colonization? It is a process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. So we look here at this map, and we're going to see all of the ownership. This is after the 1800s. We're talking about the 18th, 19th century here, when we have the scramble for Africa. And then Africa now looks like this. If you can remember the other map, and we see now Africa looks like this, and we see names like French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa. We see Belgian Congo, German East Africa. Ethiopia was not colonized, but we had a little round of the Italians in there for a minute. German Southwest Africa. These are colonizers. Process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. We also want to emphasize that these are Western and Eastern Roman populations, which is Christian. What is colonialism? Colonialism is a policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. Look at this economics and colonialism and slavery merging. Slavery being the source of colonialization and economic solvency. And we see again, this is the scramble for Africa, because Africa has resources that have yet to be tapped, have yet to be developed. And so this is what they saw. This is what the Portuguese saw when they scrolled around, when they sailed around Africa. They saw the Africans themselves. They saw high civilization. They saw gold. They saw silk. They saw things diamonds. They saw things that the Africans themselves weren't even using. They saw wealth, which they did not have. Even though Spain, inshallah, represents a period of time of high advancement, and they took that high advancement that they learned from the Muslims, inshallah, they knew how to recognize what that looked like. They knew who the Muslims were. They knew what Islam looked like. They knew when they went into Africa. They also knew, or they recognized that they were black people. They recognized that Muslims as being black. They called them Moors, but they recognized them as being black. They associated Islam with blackness. They did that just naturally. This is what they did. That's important to remember that. All right, so now how did the Europeans justify enslaving Africans? There was an economic justification, right? Portugal surrounded to the east and north by Spain and having no outlets on the Mediterranean, Portugal was compelled to regard the Atlantic Ocean as its main medium of travel. So the fall of Ceuta, which is a little town on the tip of Morocco, the Europeans controlled that. So the fall of Ceuta to the Europeans gave them their first foothold into North America. So they could take that route and go north and west in order to get to the Americas, well, to get to somewhere. They know where. This is what they said. Spain, this is economics. We have, and also imperialism, nationalism, domination and subjugation, and religion, Christianity versus Islam, European versus Moors, Black. We want to keep this in mind because we have to keep this in mind in terms of what's going on in the mind of not the Blacks, not the African slaves, in the minds of the Europeans. And this is what we want to focus on that. This is what's going on in the minds and even the hearts of the Europeans. This picture that they're seeing when they go and they colonize or they go and they enter another system. So Spain, to find the Northwest Passage in search of mineral wealth, looking at El Dorado, the city of gold, that's what they were looking for, and they aspired to spread Christianity. England, the Northwest Passage, a desire, these were really, England was probably the greediest of all of them, desired to colonize as much of the Americas as possible and add to their ever-increasing British Empire. This was their whole and sole goal. It was not, the religious goal was secondary. These were Anglicans now, not Catholics. These are Anglicans now. We got this split going on in the Catholic Church between the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Protestants. And the Pope allowed it. France claimed new land to expand their empires. France also wanted to spread Christianity and find a new route by water to the east through North America. And then France was the last to come onto the trade, inshallah, but that was a competitive edge, inshallah. They saw the benefit of it and they jumped in there. But Portugal and Spain, the first, which remember Portugal and Spain were under the control of the Muslims for 500, 600 years. So now, inshallah, now they're now on top of the world, literally on top of the world, all right? So now here's the triangle trade, what it looks like. It's a business enterprise. Let's get that in your mind. This is a business enterprise. Some who are not, you might say some who are more gratuitous, some of the slave owners and slave traders who are more gratuitous may have seen it just like that. This is my job. This is my business. This is what I do, and this is how I do it, all right? So, but there was a cognitive dissonance that also occurred there. How does your heart justify the fact that you're treating people like this, taking them through a middle path, all the things that they saw, all the things that they heard from these Africans who were enslaved, all the things that they saw them experiencing, and all the things that they victimized them with. How do you justify that in a human mind, in a human heart? And this is an issue. So we're going to talk about that. So 3 stages of the trade was take manufactured goods from Europe, cloth, spirits, tobacco, beads, guns, etc., from Europe, all right, to Africa, right? So, and then from Africa, what do we get? We get gold, bodies, person-commodification. We get people. We get slaves. To us, our slaves, all right? We baptize them, for the Portuguese and Spain, we baptize them, then we ship them. We ship them into the Caribbean islands first, Caribbean islands first, and then up into North America and the colonies. Then we return to Europe after they're farmed, after their labor's not done, but the labor reaps its benefit. Then we return the raw products from slavery: cotton, sugar, tobacco, and molasses. Molasses is very important because molasses made rum, and rum was one of the things that they used in order to sell the slave or entice the slave traders to give them slaves. So that's why it's a triangular trade, because it creates a vision of a triangle. So it's called triangular trade. And that's the transatlantic slave trade in action. So now we have the slave traders themselves. Now this was the most prolific, this was a growing wealth that the likes, most of them had never seen. It was growing wealth for all of these empires. And all of them could get in the game. And they did, they got in the game for this wealth, right? And after the wealth, like the brother said, their eyes became cloudy with the sight of the wealth. They didn't see the people after a while. The slave traders themselves used the trade to give them a boost into the upper reaches of society. Now look at these names. David and Alexander Barclay. These were enslavers from Jamaica and active in 1756. They married into the banking families of Gurney and Freem, ultimately creating Barclays Bank. You got an iPhone? You got any Apple product? That's Barclays Bank. 1762, Francis Baring, another slave trader, founded Baring's Bank. These are all bankers. 1995, the rogue trader Nick Lesson, Thomas Leland, another slave trader, became a partner in one of Liverpool's oldest banks in 1802. And after a series of takeovers, Leland Bank, which eventually became HSBC. This is the foundation of the American economy. The foundation of the American economy is based on the triangular trade. And all of their institutions, business institutions subsequently, are managed through that system, through that structure, a hierarchical structure that feeds capitalism. The New World Person-Commodification, what does that mean? How did they acquire these slaves? The transatlantic slave trade emerged as one of the most lucrative transnational enterprises ever and fueled the development of the new economic system of capitalism in Europe. It was a big money game that attracted the rich and famous of the major European nations, lured by the possibility of making a quick fortune. The trade also, now, I've been talking about the economics here for the last 3 slides. Talking about the economics, I have to remind you about the people. That's person commodification. I have to remind you about the people. Because when you start talking about the economics, the wealth, it clouds your vision. The trade also offered some small-time merchants the opportunity to buy their way into the aristocracy. All right, we have one company that's talking about, in the examples, talking about a company that actually failed, called the South Sea Company, and it was a big disaster. So they call it the South Sea Bubble. But these are small traders that got into the mix as well. So it was for the big traders, it's for the big people, the big industries like the bankers, but also for the small entities, elements, like this particular South Sea Company. Slavery was not simply a right. It was a system of production with laws governing its operation, with intellectuals exerting its moral power, with merchants exporting its goods, with whole sections of the world dependent on its cotton, with a vibrant culture for its upper class, with a militia to watch its African property. This was a colossus. This was a Genosha. This was one of the most sprawling slave societies ever erected in history, and the second largest in the world. We're going to go back now and just mention that we're talking about Black history. And I use the term Black history because now we're categorizing a people as Black, which is unreal. But we're categorizing a people as Black in order to identify their history. And it's separate from the other histories in the world. But it is important that we keep that. We're going to keep that label because that Black history underpins the history of the world. And after the fall of Andalusia. After the fall of Andalusia. So we get to the meat of our discussion, the center of our discussion, African Black American history, the narrative. This is from Sylvan Dukes, and if you don't have this book, if you want to know something about the Muslims and slavery, this is an excellent, it's a reference book. Nothing in their cultural and religious background could have prepared the African Muslims and non-Muslims for what they encountered in the New World. Those who had never been slaves or had been slave holders found a system they certainly would not have condoned at home. Even the former slaves could not have expected what was in store for them. This new world not only was racially hostile, but went contrary to what the Africans believed in, all they had learned from childhood and seen around them. The system must have been viewed as unacceptable, revolting, and inhumane. And this perception certainly shaped the response of the Muslims to their new existence as slaves of the Christians. I'm gonna have to come out and come back in again on this slide. Just follow me, people. I'm just gonna do that because this particular link that I have next is not going to open up from here. But it's a very nice piece, inshallah, giving you a description of the middle passage. So we have this abduction. We have the slaves who are abducted through kidnapping, or they're taken by war, or tribal disagreements have caused some people to be captured, and they're traded with the European on those shores. So have these different violent ways, always through violence. These slaves were always captured through some kind of violent means, and that's very important also. Because when Africa itself was the world itself was a semi-peaceful area after Islam, a semi-peaceful environment going on. You had wars, you had slavery, etc., but you didn't have it to the caliber that was happening here with this slave trade. Because the way that they were able to abduct slaves, the way they were able to capture the slaves was a violent process in and of itself. If we look at the narratives, we'll see. But this is the middle passage, and this is one of the ships. And this is when you look at this boat, you're looking at the shape of the boat, which is almost shaped like a human being, but we look at the shape, and all of these little rows you see in between, these are people. These are people. People.
At last, when the ship we were in had gotten all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put on the deck so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. And some of us had been permitted to stay on deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers.
This is Alonso Aquino is his slave, the slave that was captured, and this is his story about the Middle Passage. So what I'm going to do is I'm giving you just a little sketch of the process of capturing and shipping slaves and laying them on, putting and selling them, and then putting them on the plantation. Just a sketch. I'm not going deep into that, inshallah, because we don't have time. And going deep into that is really not even necessary, because you know the theme. It was an ugly system. It was an ugly process. It did not humanize, but it was a process of dehumanization. And regardless of where you tell the story from, how you tell the story, you're going to see that, just that, the process of dehumanizing, which we go all the way back to our background, to our context, and we see this was the point. This was the point, because the resistance in Andalusia in 1492, when the Muslims were essentially defeated, and then in 1502, when they were required to accept Christianity or else. So we have the Inquisition going on, where they forced them to accept Christianity, or they slaughtered them, or they were forced to leave. All right, so this is the same process here, where the effort is to Christianize by dehumanizing. All right, so here is the auction, the slave auction. This is the next phase. Once the Middle Passage, then we get to the slave auction, and there's just this quick story narrative from Harriet Hill, who was enslaved in Georgia. Also, these are the advertisements. These were person-commodification, turning people into commodities. This is the process of turning them into the humiliation, because on the ship, in every instance, when they left Africa, when they brought them, they were stripped naked. They were stripped naked. So this is, you look at the story of Adam and Hawa, and this is what the Shaitan did. He caused them to show themselves, to show their parts. He caused them to remove their modesty. And then when Adam came down, he asked Allah Ta'ala, please give me clothes. Allah Ta'ala gave him it talks about the raiment of the righteous is better for you. But to take someone's, especially a female, male, female, it doesn't matter, but to strip them of their clothing, that is their culture, that is their tribe, that is their family, that is their lineage being stripped, just in that particular process. So here we see, you're not going to see too many pictures of men being dressed. The other thing was they like to see them, like to watch them walk around to show their prowess, their physical prowess. But we have $1,200 to $1,250 for Negroes. This is the term they use, Negroes. My daughter can tell you the meaning for that, because that's been skewed as well. But Negroes, and William F. Talbot is the one who has posted this particular advertisement. I've been sold in my life twice to my knowing. I was sold away from my dear old mammy at 3 years old, but I can remember it. I remembers it. It like selling a calf from the cow. Exactly, but we are human beings and ought to be better than do such. I was too little to remember my price. I was sold to be a nursemaid. They bought me and took me on a way that time. The next time they put me up in a wagon and auctioned me off. That time I didn't sell. A man come up to our wagon and say, he split the difference. They made the trade. I sold on that spot for $1,400. I was 9 or 10 years old. I remembers it. Of course I do. I never could forget it. On the plantation, we have a story from Sarah Allen, who was born a slave of John and Sally Goodwin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Before the Civil War, her owners came to Texas, located near a small town then called Freedom. She lives at 3322 Fruita Street, El Paso, Texas. It's important that you're able to locate the place and the time and the slave owners in these situations so that you can actually see that. You want to be able to visualize that, because this is the burden that is being carried by most of the Blacks that are here in my generation. And the children of my generation also have that legacy. So this is being carried. And which I said earlier that we have a cause, and we talked about the cause, the European colonization and European expansion and exploration, and we also and their desire to convert everyone to Christianity. And we have the effect is what we're looking at now is the effect. I was birthed in time of bondage. You know, some people are ashamed to tell it, but I thank God I was allowed to see them times as well as now. It's a pretty hard story how cruel some of the masters was, but I had the luck to be with the good white people. But some I knew were put on the block and sold. I remember when they'd come to John Goodwin's place to buy, but he not sell any. They'd have certain days when they'd sell off the block, and they took chillin' away from mothers screaming for their children. I was birthed into Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains. When the white people come to Texas, the colored people come with them. That's been a long time. My mom was named Charlotte. My pa Parks Adams. He's a white man. I guess I'm about 80 some years old. You know, slavery, in slavery times when they had bad masters, they'd run away, but we didn't want to. My missus would see her people had something good to eat every Sunday morning. You had to mind your missus and masters, and you'd be treated well. I think I was about 12 when they freed us, and we stayed with master about a year. Then went to John Eccles' place and rented some land. We made 2 bales of cotton, and it was the first money we ever saw. Back when we lived with Master Goodwin, we had big candy pull-ins, invite everybody and play. We had good times. The worst thing, we didn't ever have no schooling till after I married. Then I went to school 2 weeks. My husband was a teacher. He never was a slave. His father bought freedom through a blacksmith shop some way. I had a nice wedding. My dress was white and trimmed with blue ribbon. My second day dress was white with red dots. I had a beautiful veil and a wreath and about 2-3 waiters for the table that day. That's the plantation. So now we've gone from the Middle Passage, we've gone through the ocean, we've gone through the plantation. Now we get to emancipation, which was in 1865 when actually all the slaves were quote unquote emancipated. But we have 1862 when Mr. Lincoln actually proclaimed emancipation of all of the slaves who belonged to owners in those states that were not Union. It's very important that he always had caveats to his proclamations. Proclamation was that all those slaves who are owned by owners in those states that were not Union were free. We're free. There is implication there, inshallah, which we're not going to discover today, but just keep that in mind because the 13th Amendment does the same thing. There's a caveat to the 13th Amendment that perpetuates bondage, and I'm going to flip it up to bondage of the now Black African Americans in this country. So the story of Juneteenth, which you just experienced, witness, is the Emancipation Proclamation outlawing slavery in the United States passed January 1st, 1863. But it took over 2 years for the news to reach some enslaved people. In Texas, no one told the slaves that the owners told the slaves that they were free. The owners worked them for 2.5 more years. Not until 2 months after the Civil War ended did these African Americans finally find out they were free. Imagine if there had been social media at that time. All right, I just want you to look at this map right here. I can't expand it for you, but you can see the dark places and the lighter dark, the grayer areas. All of these. Now, this map is about slaves in the southern states in 1860, right? So we've gone through the Middle Passage, we've gone through the auction, we went to the plantation. Now they are fixed and they're settled into these. Now remember that a slave on one plantation may not stay there permanently. They were constantly moving, being separated, moving from one plantation to another, depending on certain circumstances. They may have misbehaved. They may have a tendency to run away. So they'll send them to a crueler master. They may have a nice master, but the nice master might die, like in the case of Frederick Douglass, just shipped to another plantation. So there was no security on the plantation. And children, and we know Sojourner Truth had 13 children. All of them were sent to different places. And by the way, she was the first woman. She was a woman, she was an African, and she was a slave to get her son back in court. So she is one of our legacies. But you see the slaves, these are all slave states. The United States of America was called a slave state. The United States of America was called, at one point, it was called a slave state. So you have all of these, and this is to the tune of something like 32 million people that they have here in these various, collectively in these various places. This is a census of 1860, and I can't pull it up because I have to go out of the slide. But let's look at some pictures here. These are African Americans in slavery. So it is important that you're able to name them, that you're able to look at these people and you're able to name them. Although these slaves are not with us today, but it's important that you're able to look at them, that you're able to see them and name them. So this person here, inshallah, his name is Facina and Renti by their slaveholders. They took their pictures. They were proud of their slave system. They were proud of owning slaves. It was a status symbol. The more slaves you had, the wealthier you looked, the wealthier you were. That's the more work that could get done. And the work was done all day and all night long. We're talking picking cotton, if you know it, and the cotton did increase the ability to produce more cotton. It was a boon for the Industrial Revolution. Now this is Lucy holding Charlotte. She's holding the slave owner's child. Remember that Sarah said she was a nursemaid. This is what they became, nursemaids. These were young people. Again, African American woman holding a white child. And again, we have the same. Nursemaid holding Oscar Menard. Oscar Menard is the slave owner's son. This guy is 72 years old. He's a blacksmith. We don't even know that the slaves picked up lots of skills in this period of time. They picked up lots of skills. So this is Isaac. His name is Isaac Jefferson. And this is an enslaved American woman also. Now, this one is very, very interesting. These are called contraband. These children are called contraband. That's the intelligent contraband. This is what they call them, intelligent contraband. And what you also put on it, the person's commodification. This is the process of turning human beings into commodities. They call these people intelligent contraband. And also, this young man here, this young boy here, he has been traveling through swamps, 500 miles to freedom. That's why he looks tattered. Which you looked tattered probably earlier because children is another story in terms of children. This is a whole family here. Whole family in different places. 5 generations of enslaved African-American family. 5 generations. And here we have the enslaved African-Americans here again, the same. This is a population of enslaved and the same going on here, women and all the way down. And it's the conditions under which they were placed. And there is some narration about the conditions in which they were placed, especially the children. All right. So that is an illustration of slavery, what it looked like, and just a sketch of the effect of the transatlantic slave trade and American slavery. The plantation was about as big, says Charlie Williams of his Mississippi birthplace, where he lived with about 100 other enslaved African Americans. Although most slaves lived on small farms with fewer than 10 slaves, the large plantation with hundreds of slaves has come to define our image of the antebellum South. That's after Emancipation, after the Civil War. If I had had my life to live over, I would die fighting rather than be a slave again. I want no man's yoke on my shoulders no more. Now, we're looking at these and we're seeing the attitude of resistance and rebellion, which is always playing out. You had Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, you had Nat Turner, you had the Brazilian rebellion. Many rebellions were in the mix, but there were traitors who told on them. There were people who revealed. John Brown committed 2 acts of resistance against the United States against slavery. Many of the Quakers were abolitionists. Many abolitionists existed and were attempting to do what? To abolish slavery. To abolish slavery. Not necessarily to remove the condition of the people who were enslaved in this case, but to abolish slavery itself. This is what their effort was. I remember when they put him on the block to sell him, the ones between 18 and 30 always bring the most money. The auctioneer, he stand off at a distance and cry him off as they stand on the block. I can hear his voice as long as I live. 87, 97. You want to look too, you hear slaves 100 and some years old, 112 years old, 75 years old, 80 years. They lived a long time. And I like to think that these people these older folk that we see at 97 and 87, et cetera, that they live to tell the tale. So if slavery is abolished, what fuels a Black history? And in a nutshell, it's the myth of racism. So now we are coming to the ugly truth. Much of Western European history conditions us. Now, the other thing too I'm looking at, I sketched out the period or the character and the story from the slaves. I sketched it out very briefly. I spent a lot of time on the background to that, on how that slave system was initiated and was carried out. Why? Because what we should be looking at this history from, the viewpoint we should be looking at this history from, is the viewpoint of slavery. Who engaged in slavery? Was the European engaged in this slave system, initiated and engaged this slave system? So we have to look at the perspective of Black history from the European perspective, not from the Black, because the Black people's perspective, quote unquote, African Americans, etc., and others, their perspective is the effect of slavery, not the institution itself, but the effect, and they represent the effect of slavery. We can see from the African Americans today, we can see the effect of a dehumanizing system, which carried forward into an emancipation period. We're going to be talking about the timeline of the civil rights movement. Why civil rights? The question was asked, and again, I go back to that question. If slavery is abolished, what fuels Black history? Why do we still have Black history beyond 1865? Why is there still an issue? And that's the myth of racism. Much of Western European history conditions us to see human differences in simplistic opposition to each other. Dominant, subordinate, good, bad, up, down, superior, inferior. In a society where the good is defined in terms of profit rather than human need. Remember our definition from the United Nations. Profit, economics, folks who are traded in exchange for goods. This is how they see it, the slave system. And there must always be, in that kind of society, there must always be some group of people who, through systemized oppression, and this is another word we have to keep in mind, oppression, systematized oppression, not systematized racism, systematized oppression, can be made to feel surplus, to occupy the place of the dehumanized inferior. Within this society, that group is made up of Black and third world people, working class people, older people, and women. We're going to see the various movements that have occurred in the society and in the world. After, this is post-transatlantic slavery. What's going on in the world? We see oppression everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And we also want to take it back and realize that these things fall after the fall of Andalusia. Andalusia was not an empire. It was a region, a state, but it had impact that spread all over the world. It was an umbrella to Africa, like Iraq and Iran and the Tigris and Euphrates are a crown to Arabia. False narrative of racism. Here's the emphasis. Here's where it comes from. Listen, this is very interesting. Listen to this. This has come from Genesis 9:10. And the sons of Noah that went forth from, and I do apologize, Allah forgive me, inshallah, but I have to tell this story. I have to read it as it is. You're not going to like it, but just hold yourselves. And the sons of Noah that went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole world overspread. And Noah began to be a husbandman. That means he took care of animals. And he farmed, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine. I will do that. And was drunken. I will do that. And he was uncovered within his tent. I will do that. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward. And they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. Now, if we look back at the story of Prophet Adam and Iblis, when Iblis said, "I will not bow down to him because I'm better than him. I'm made from fire, free of smoke, and he's made of clay." The implication there is racism. That's an implication. So the Christians, the Catholics, push this forward on their people as an implication of racism, because Africans are people of Ham. They're children of Ham. And the children of Ham, again, quote unquote, are Black. Now, how they got that, how they pulled that out, just like that, how they pulled that out from Iblis is very curious. But that's how they justify, because the slave owners, especially the people as overseers and as slave plantation managers, they were having a problem adjusting to the treatment that was given that they had to mete out to these people. It was called cognizant dissonance, in the sense that they knew this was morally wrong, but they had to do it. It was a dichotomy. It was their job. It was their money. It was their means of wealth. So they had to do it. So they had to justify it. So they justified it through this particular biblical passage. Now look at what, and I have this this statement from Allah from the Quran, where Allah Ta'ala says, because you have put me in error, I will surely, Shaitan says, in response to Allah Ta'ala kicking him out of the garden, he says, and giving him reprieve, making that contract with Allah Ta'ala, he says, because you have put me in error, I will surely sit and wait for them on your straight path. Then I will come to them from before them and behind them and their right and on their left, and you will not find most of them grateful to you. Now we have a situation here in the Americas of slavery and the struggles for humanity. One of the things I note in all of my studies and in growing up with a post-Reconstruction mother and a Reconstruction baby, my grandmother, and watching my family dynamics, my extended family, my immediate family, my extended family, even my father's family on that side as well, the whole character of Black people was peaceful and dignified. I did not find any the manners of heathen or barbarians in my family, even of the people who were considered to be lower than my family. My family was my mother's family was considered to be middle class. Even to the people who were considered to be lower middle class, who we said lived on the other side of the tracks, where all the prostitution and the drinking and the gaming went on. We were not allowed to go there. But even on that side of the tracks, they had dignity in what they did. If a child, if my father if my uncle or any of my uncles were found on that side of the tracks, a prostitute would send them home. You don't belong here, boy. Go home. And we were in protected neighborhoods, and we were calculating. We were intelligent to the extent that we knew how to deal with white people. My family knew how to deal with white people. And so when they came around, we could see a difference in the behavior in terms of how the Blacks dealt with the white people. They subjugated themselves, but they knew they were not subjugated. They knew they were not subjugated, but they subjugated themselves for the occasion. It was beautiful to watch. In my lifetime, I didn't suffer racism until, I didn't really see racism until, even though I went into an integrated system, it was imposed on me, I did not see racism until I was 21. I did not see it. I did not experience it. I did not feel it. Because we were in a protected neighborhood and my mother did not allow us to experience these types of feelings. But when I did see it, and even going through my research here, going through this, it makes me extremely angry. So why racism? We needed to find laborers because Native Americans resisted and white indentured slaves were impermanent. The transatlantic slave trade would enable, this is what they believed, they were on a missionary zeal. And you know this, the missionaries are the first responders into Africa, first responders into these islands, first responders, Christian missionaries go in, now it's NGOs, they go in and they prepare the people for Christianity and try to proselytize Christianity and try to turn them into Christians. This is what they do. Jehovah's Witnesses, you know this, they've been in the school, in our school, passing out pamphlets over in Zimbabwe, over in East Africa, passing out pamphlets. This is a mission that they're on. Just like Muslims should be on the mission to establish Islam, these Christians are on their mission. They're on their mission 24/7. I remember I was in a class, an Arabic class, learning Arabic, and there was like maybe 6 or 7 Christians in that class. I'm curious, why are you here? And when the professor asked, why are you here? Why do you want to learn Arabic? She said, so I can go to Saudi Arabia and teach them how to be Christian. This was in 19-something, I can't remember the date. Anyway, transatlantic slave trade would enable Africans, especially the Mohammedans, to come in contact with Christianity. Favorable trade winds, look at the divine providence. They were favorable trade winds. This is what the Africans traveled on, these trade winds, on these currents into South America and into North America. So the Christians were aware of this and they said, this is divine providence for to approve this trade. Racism is a particular form of oppression. It stems from discrimination. We should look at it like this: racism, oppression. Instead of racism, we should be saying oppression. It stems from discrimination against a group of people based on the idea that some inherited characteristic, such as skin color, makes them inferior to the oppressors. Yet the concepts of race and racism are modern inventions. They arose and became part of the dominant ideology of society on context with the African slave trade at the dawn of capitalism in 1500s and 1600s. We have that timeline going on when 1400 Portuguese went in there, and then 1500 the Spanish went in there. So the American dilemma of civil rights, this is where we're looking at racism with the perpetuity of oppression. The perpetuity of oppression is the race card, right? Why do we have to have oppression? Why do we have to have a body of people who are oppressed in a capitalist system? Because that body of people are only concerned about their immediate needs. And when they're concerned about their immediate needs, then they buy. When they buy, we can sell. And the more they buy, the more we produce for them to buy. And if they don't want to buy what we have, we'll make markets for them to buy. And we'll keep them boxed into a particular system, a particular geographics, so that they can buy. And then we'll send in our merchants to sell to them what we want them to have, whether it be good or bad for them. We're going to give them, make it available, make it cheap, make it easy for them to have access to. But as far as productivity is concerned, that belongs to us. That belongs to the stock marketeers, because you don't find the body of black, and specifically black people, because our folks from overseas, inshallah, who've come here, immigrated here, they don't have this ethic. They produce. You know, I always talk about the Somalian sisters, how business minded they are. The Arabs went into countries and they thought, how can we make this better? But the African slaves were being taken as slaves and being dehumanized. So Africans were thinking business. We can do business. They were, and the productivity of Africa at that particular point, we still have resources in Africa that have not been tapped. At the point of African slave trade, productivity in Africa ceased. So Africa fell asleep as well. So therefore, inshallah, it can be awakened. But one of the themes, one of the slogans of the civil rights movement was, if not now, when? So we come from emancipation, we come into the Jim Crow laws, we come into the expansion of the prison system by taking men into prison. We're talking about the 13th Amendment, which we're going to look at here. 13th Amendment, inshallah, had a caveat: as long as they're free, as long as they don't commit a crime. When they commit a crime, they go back into slavery. That's the caveat. That's the only way the Southern representatives would accept the 13th Amendment and pass and sign off on it. And that's exactly what they signed off on, and it is prevalent in the system today. So we're talking RRR, we're talking about Reconstruction rights, racism, and resegregation. We're not going to spend any time looking at the timeline long. No, from 1865 all the way over to 2001, right? 2001, where we are right now. Still hollering about, where are my rights? But I just want to go through this slideshow here, which is so beautiful in terms of the effort, different kind of effort, resistance and abolitionism and slave revolts, rebellions. We have a different kind of rebellion, different kind of resistance going on, a different way to respond to this oppression that's going on now. I'm just going to go through a few of these slides for you, inshallah, not a lot, because we're running out of time. I'm running out of time. So this is reliving the civil rights movement in 55 powerful photos. I'm not going to do all 55, but let's look at the gallery. So we're talking about Martin Luther King here. In 1968, he was killed, assassinated in Alabama when he was doing a march against for the garbage collectors. This is a person cleaning up after his death. Beatrice Bailey, she's cleaning up after his death. This is Honor. And now we have here flaming in Washington, D.C., 7th Street on April 6th. After the riots, there were riots in Detroit, Cleveland, in Ohio, and in D.C. after his death. There was a response, like we see now going on right now. This is in 1957, 1956. Schools were integrated in 1954. This is the milieu that Black students had to walk into when they integrated these schools. And remember, the Black students were by themselves. We're going to look at another picture with a reference. Look at this picture and see what you think. This is a first grader being escorted by U.S. federal marshals to a grade school that is being integrated. Look at her. All by herself. There's another picture here. All by herself. 1957. We came from protected neighborhoods. The children were highly protected in their neighborhoods when it was segregated. To be brought into, all by themselves, real soldiers, because of racism. The Jim Crow laws were underpinned by a racist thought. It was oppression. So we moved them into the school systems. Nobody there, not mommy, not daddy, not sister, not brother, not friend, not neighbor, nobody, just me. And I'm in the first grade. 1957. And then we have this rebellion, these symbolic rebellion, symbolism. John Lewis and John Carlos, Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising a hand at the Olympics. It was powerful. I saw this. Then you have the meeting of the two variants in the movement. Which one was, and this one is coming, is being reactivated. And Martin Luther King was shot when he was changing, his attitude was changing because he saw no change. This is CORE. This is my father and mother instituted this movement in Ohio. And they're preparing, these people are being trained for nonviolent resistance. And I think I've told a story about my mother who had to be moved to another job because she couldn't manage nonviolent resistance. Then we have some resistance here on the street. This white boy saying, move off the street. Racism. He sees a black man, so he immediately begins to oppress. It's been trained into him. He doesn't have any choice. It's in his mind when he sees him. So it's a visual picture of I'm better than him. You see, we go all the way back to Adam and Iblis. I'm better than you. Therefore, I will not bow to you. But he's saying, no, you're not. This is on the street, on the ground. There was resistance going on all the time, even from the children. Alhamdulillah. Black and white together. This is Wally Nelson was my mother and father's best friend. And this is a rally in support of jailed civil rights leader Wally Nelson. He was put in jail in Ohio, and this is a rally for him. And we have here, and this is the last one, freedom riders involved in the ride in the buses. The freedom riders, we know about the freedom riders and how oppressed they were. But the nonviolence, the strength of it, and the dignity of it was important to highlight white people. That's what it did. It highlighted the behavior of white people. If you see their faces, and today the same thing is happening. The behavior of white people is being highlighted. And this is so important to Islam because that's how we determine who is humane, and who is not. We have to look at it from that perspective. One more, and then we're going to get out of this. And this is hoses being sprayed on demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. Do the math. That's not far away. And we have the same thing going on now. You're going to see these events escalate to the same thing that happened then is going to happen now. Because they cannot change unless their mindset changes. As long as they're able to see a people that look like us, whether any colored person from anywhere, then they're going to justify their own existence of white imperialism, supremacy, and justify their right to oppress. So alhamdulillah, we're rounding down with the light of Islam. We're going to look at Islam. And you know, when you look at these, when I look at my presentation as I'm going through it and I come to these last part, and then, you know, as I was practicing it last night, looking at it last night, I said to myself, how do I justify attaching this piece on Islam to this? But look at the changes in your feelings as we go through these next slides. Look what happens to your heart. Here is relief, here is solution. What does the Prophet ﷺ say? O people, no prophet will be raised after me, and no new ummah will be raised after you, which means that's a responsibility. Now you have a responsibility. He says, no, as God has made you one community, so do not be divided. You go all the way back to Andalusia and the division in Andalusia that caused Andalusia to be reconquered. Do not be divided. He says, an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab or a non-Arab over an Arab, nor is a white man to be preferred to a black man, nor a black man to a white man. So now, how is the Prophet ﷺ in 1400 years ago talking about the issues of today? He is contemporary. He is the last one. That's the reason why I put this slide first. There will be no prophet after me. And no new ummah. No new ummah. I'm not going to read these, but these were the people who were here in America before, recorded presence of Muslims in America before Columbus. What was their mission? Remember Idris' I think it was Abu Bakr on the shores of Africa said, if there's land over there, I will go over there and I will bring your deen over. I'll raise your name over there. I'll bring your deen over there. And they did. Coming from Spain, coming from West Africa, they did. I knew several people who must have been from what I have since learned Mohammedans, though at that time I had never heard of the religion Muhammad. There was one man on this plantation who prayed 5 times every day, always turning his face to the east when in the performance of his devotion. Bilali was a slave on a plantation in South Carolina, which, by the way, my daughter's family is on her father's side. Their plantation history is in South Carolina. But the master was so impressed. His master was so impressed with him that he allowed him to set up one of the first masjids on a plantation. The first, I guess, is probably the only masjid that was set up on a plantation, which survives today. Inshallah, his lineage survives today in Sapalo, which is in South Carolina, on an island off the coast of Charleston, I think. And Umar ibn Said, you've heard of this man before. They just digitized his book, the only handwritten biography of himself. He was they call him Moorish or Moor, etc. And he was born in 1770 in the African region that then called Fuda Toro, which is also West Africa near the Senegal River, which forms that Senegal northern border with Mauritania. And he was enslaved and sold to South Carolina planters. Said escaped and made his way to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he was imprisoned after entering a Christian church to pray. A lot of the Muslims accepted feigned Christianity in order to keep the weight off their backs. We have this man called Ibrahimi. I didn't tell his story, but it's a very interesting story. You can look it up anyway. So 30% of the African slaves were from West and Central Africa, Senegambia, and Cameroon. Much of the difficulties that they faced were based upon their Islamic practices, and slave masters attempted to separate them from their culture and religious roots to civilize them into Christianity. Deal explains how, despite such efforts, many slaves retained aspects of their customs and traditions and found new creative ways to express themselves. And she assigns the blues, which is a musical form, to the slaves, saying that the sound of the blues sounds like the call of the adhan. So that relationship between their Islamic past. Then these other three slaves, Salih Bilali, don't have time to go through them, Muhammad Ali bin Said and Muhammad Gardo, all have three different stories about how they dealt with slavery in the colonies, in Africa as well as in America and in Europe. The legacy here, we have our African American legacy with us today. This is a survey by Pew that says half of Black Muslims are converts to Islam, and they do relate back to their African heritage when they think about one sister who was, she was a jazz musician, Muslim, she was Muslim. A lot of jazz artists became Muslim, as we say, back in the day. And she said to me when she met me, she's my elder, and she met me, she said, listen, she said, somebody said a tayyat for you. Somebody in this country said a tayyat for you. She said, somebody prayed for you to be Muslim. So we live that legacy with ourselves right now today, inshallah. And then most Black Muslims say there's a lot of discrimination against Black Muslims in the US. And I wanted you to take away today, this is true, there's a lot of discrimination against Blacks because we have been colored by the myth of racism. Now know that when you practice this myth of racism, first of all, Allah called the shaitan a kufar because he would not bow down, and because of what he said, he called him a kufar. So to be an oppressor is to be a kufar, is to be in a state of kufar, especially if you're oppressed because you believe somebody is less than you by virtue of what they look like. That's an action of kufar. This is what Allah says in Quran. You can verify that. So 79% of Black Muslims believe the United States needs to continue making changes in order for Blacks to have equal rights with whites. By comparison, non-Black Muslims are less likely, 66%, are less likely to get into that conversation. Slaves are mentioned in at least 29 verses of the Quran. Allah prescribes remedies for slavery to preserve, not destroy the human being. And we go to our second definition here, where he says in this ayah, this surah here, this ayah, he says, this is, then secure their bonds. This is how we deal with slaves. Then secure their bonds. Secure their bonds, take them as prisoners, and either confer favor afterwards, we set them free, or ransom them, sell them, if it's beneficial to you, for something else, until the war lays down its burdens. These are the remedies Allah has in His Quran. And the other one is, and what can make you know what is, there's 26 occasions, but they all center around these remedies for slavery. Because remember, the Prophet ﷺ promoted manumission, freedom of slaves. Treat them like you treat yourselves. And what can make you know what is breaking through the difficult path? Allah says it is the freeing of a slave. So in the light of Islam, the cure for racism, oh man, can you know this ayat 49:13? I don't have to read it for you. You've read it many, many times, inshallah. This is the cure. It does mean, is it exacted? Do we have this cure within ourselves? No, we don't. No, we don't have it. I even have to accuse myself. I'm not going to accuse myself, but if I was to accuse myself and people know me, they'll say, oh, she doesn't like white women. Unless they have hijab. So therefore, I have to accuse myself for this. But we know this, and remember that Islam is developmental. It's purification of the self, purification of the soul. It doesn't happen like right now. It's a process to get to this, where you feel that everybody has been created from male and female, that Adam is your father, and Hawa is your mother, and you walk through the world like that. Last but not least, inshallah, this is your task, your duty, and I'm not going to read the earlier stuff because it's talking about purification. That's what this ayat, in my understanding, is talking about purification, what is pure, what is good. And so this is pure and good. This day, those who disbelieve have despaired of defeating your religion. And this is what this is the reason why the slave trade was so predominant in Africa, because there were so many Muslims were there. And they saw what Muslims could do. In Spain, in the Ottoman Empire, they saw that empire spread across a continent from a few men, from a few people, just on Iman. They knew what Muslims could do, so they had to sequester. They had to extract that from them, and this is the policy as well today. Extract the Islam, inshallah. We have the constitutional dictum, separation of church and state, free exercise, but not free to establish. So how you're going to have the deen of Islam, without establishing it? That's impossible. So what do you do instead? You use another system in order to get your rights. And how is that possible? How are you going to get them? So he said, this day, those who believe have despaired of defeating your religion, and so fear not, but fear me. This day I have perfected your religion and have completed my favor upon you, and I have approved for you Islam as religion. But whoever is forced by severe hunger, and we talk about slavery here, and Muslims in slavery, but whoever is forced by severe hunger with no inclination to sin, then indeed Allah is forgiving and merciful. And we know that Allah Ta'ala has looked down on our brothers and sisters who suffered this horrendous attack, and they still maintained a spirit of dignity and honor and appreciation and love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So may Allah Ta'ala make us amongst those.
It's not far. The destination is not far. The narrative of slavery ebbs with the history of black African Americans in this country. No other people stand to witness man's inhumanity to men, women, as do the African American peoples. From black African American history, the measure of injustice and oppression is keen. And African American Muslims can view the world through slavery, then see the truth of the Quran. The black African American Muslims can peer through the looking glass of slavery with the remedy of it to tune their behavior away from the scenarios of slavery to combat the anger over the past with the patience elicited from the Quran and the ways of the Prophet ﷺ. Nonetheless, a people without retaliation and without retribution wander through the society daily, attempting to etch a semblance of humanity from centuries of inhumanity. If we, black African American Muslims, do not divine our purpose for surviving and thriving against the odds, why then do we have the light of Islam? Why then do we have the stories of Muslim slaves whose remembrance forces us to travel back to Africa, to Andalusia, to history, if not find our own selves as Muslims in America for the sake of the message of Islam? African American history, black African Muslim history, is the only American history after the indigenous people's history. That is an unfinished story that eventually will intertwine with the Islamic world, inshallah. In the meantime, I'm sure that our black African American Muslims, those converted and those born, presence in this country as it was in the past, is a blessing yet to be revealed, and is a circumstance that will benefit all Muslims everywhere. That is our history. This is our reality. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.